The decades-long war on marijuana is slowly coming to an end. More than 50 years since then-President Nixon declared a war on drugs, the U.S. has spent $47 billion combating drug use, with 15.7 million people arrested on marijuana charges in just the last 2 decades. Now it's time to wake up, Washington, because Americans' views on marijuana use have been rapidly changing. A recent Pew poll shows 57% of people believe the plant should be legalized for recreational use. We recently attended the Cannabis Policy Summit in Washington, D.C., where most people we spoke to believe legalization could have a far-reaching impact, particularly on minorities. Take a look.
I think that for so long people have been held back for it, incarcerated.
It should have never been illegal in the first place, and this is really the first way that we can help Black and brown folks all across the country.
No one should be in prison for a plant.
Inmates sitting in federal prison for their lives, while we have other companies making billions of dollars for the same thing. People's lives are at stake. There's nothing more important than the people in federal prison for marijuana. We need to get them out. They got arrested in the 1990s when we had tough on drug policies going on in this country, and they're still there, and we need to get them out.
It's a closet issue, but it's an issue that needs to be thoroughly discussed.
It's proven that it can help with so many different things. As I said before, alcohol is poison, but the culture around that is just very normalized, whereas cannabis is a medicine and it's still very taboo.
We sell the majority of our products to 60 to 70-year-old adults. They really need the medicine for their joints and stuff, and they're tired of taking prescription pills.
I think that descheduling needs to happen because we need more freedom, and that can bring more money into the economy of America.
This is a bipartisan issue. I mean, Republicans, they should be the top of the Republicans' food chains when it comes to economy, states' rights, everything that they preach.
In a historic shift, the Biden administration is taking a step towards reclassifying marijuana as a less dangerous drug. But with millions of Americans arrested in the past and thousands currently still serving sentences on marijuana convictions, how will the reclassification affect their future? Joining us now from the Last Prisoner Project are Executive Director and General Counsel Sarah Gersten and Director of Advocacy Stephanie Shepard. Thank you both for joining me here today. Sarah, I want to start with you. Marijuana has been listed as a Schedule I drug for more than 50 years. But what will President Biden's effort to move it to a Schedule III drug actually mean for Americans?
So, as you noted, this is an incredibly significant move, and I don't want to downplay the significance of the reclassification of cannabis from Schedule I. This is the most significant shift in cannabis policy and drug policy really since the inception of the Controlled Substances Act. Right now, cannabis is scheduled as the most serious drug classification, Schedule I, meaning that the federal government believes that it has no medical value and a high potential for abuse. So it is monumental for the federal government to acknowledge that there is medicinal properties to cannabis. But unfortunately, the federal government is still really lagging behind the vast majority of states and the vast majority of the American populace who believe that cannabis should be fully legalized. And I want to make that very clear. This shift to a Schedule III will loosen restrictions on research and medical uses of cannabis. It will not fully legalize cannabis at the federal level, and it remains to be seen how it will interplay with those existing state and medical markets.
So talking in terms of a timeline, Sarah, how soon and where will the effects of this move be felt? And will it encourage maybe more states to move towards making marijuana legal?
So, of course, this is the federal government. This is not going to happen instantaneously. This is really just the next step in a lengthy administrative rulemaking process. So right now, the rule goes to the Office of Management and Budget. OMB will send it back to the DEA, and they'll initiate the notice and comment period. That could come with administrative hearings. There might be legal challenges. We've already seen groups coming out to say that they will initiate legal challenges to this proceeding. And so this could be a months, years-long process, but I do think there's a huge incentive for this administration to get it done before the election. I do think that move will encourage states, those few holdout states that don't have yet a legal or medical marketplace, and again, that's the vast minority of states, to legalize marijuana, at least in some form, because again, the most significant effect is going to be loosening those restrictions around research. And so states will actually be able to better see that legalizing cannabis, at least for medical use, is really in the best interest of public health and public safety.
Stephanie, turning to you, you were convicted of conspiracy to distribute marijuana in 2010. As a first-time nonviolent offender, you served 9 years of your 10-year sentence. Could you tell us about that part of your life and what happened?
It was a hard pill to swallow, but I swallowed it because at the time it was illegal, and I accepted that. It's affected my life mostly by the amount of loss that I felt. Everyone loses something in life. You lose jobs, you lose relationships, you lose money, but consider what that must feel like to lose all of that at once. And that's the most difficult part about it. And you can't do anything about it.
Did you find that there was, obviously there's this advocacy organization you're a part of, and there's other advocacy organizations in this realm, but did you find that back then, that was over 10 years ago, there was a support system at that point?
No, there was nothing like Last Prisoner Project around at that time. Even as state after state began legalizing, and I'm sitting in prison thinking, well, what about me? If it's now acceptable and being normalized out in the world, what about me and the thousands of people like me sitting in prisons? So we didn't have this type of advocacy. We didn't have these voices that we have now. So it's amazing to be able to be a part of it. And it's healing for me to be a part of it, honestly. Because it's infuriating to see what's going on in the industry today, but know that Michael Woods is serving a life sentence for cannabis.
Sarah, moving back to the Biden administration's move, did this catch you by surprise, or is this a part of a larger movement, a larger trend happening in the country?
This is absolutely part of a larger trend. It's something that really cannabis advocates, the cannabis industry, have been waiting with bated breath to happen since President Biden announced in 2022 his initiation of this process to reschedule cannabis. And that was really part of a three-part announcement where he initiated this process, which started with Health and Human Services to reclassify cannabis. He also issued mass pardons for cannabis offenses at the federal level, and that's an action he followed up with the expansion of last year. And we do hope that this is just the first few steps in an even larger journey. Again, the vast majority of Americans believe that cannabis should be fully legalized and that no one should be incarcerated for cannabis. And that's another thing that President Biden campaigned on in 2020. He's made that a part of his racial justice and criminal justice plans. And so those pardons are a good first step, but they haven't done anything to actually release individuals who are still incarcerated at the federal level for cannabis. So we are very hopeful that this action will embolden the administration to take further clemency action to actually release those individuals from prison.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll be watching to see what the administration does and to see if President Biden says anything about this on the campaign trail. Stephanie, now you're an advocate for those affected by marijuana-related sentences. How have minorities been disproportionately impacted by the stringent laws and restrictions, and how has that affected American families?
As we know, Blacks are 4 to 5 times more likely to be arrested and given a lengthy prison sentence for cannabis. So as a Black woman myself, sitting there and getting this sentence and now being out and seeing what the industry is, that needs to trickle down. That needs to trickle down to the most vulnerable communities. It wasn't just me going to prison. It was my family. It was them going through the same struggles. And that trickles down to the community. And when a community is hurt, then this country is hurt. So it's really important that people realize that discrepancy in sentences and bring people home.
Absolutely. And Sarah, why do you think it's taken really so long for marijuana to be legalized at the state level and for this move to happen from the Biden administration at the federal level?
I think it really speaks to the kind of stigma that Stephanie's talking about. We know now that cannabis prohibition was never based on public health or public safety. It was always based on marginalizing communities, particularly communities of color. And I think there's really been a recognition of that amongst the American people, who, again, the vast majority from all demographics believe that cannabis should be fully legalized. And states have caught up to that. Again, we have a vast majority of states that have some form of legalized marijuana. And so I think that we now have reached a tipping point, and this move shows to me it's just a matter of time before cannabis is fully legalized in all states and at the federal level.
Stephanie, obviously none of this will give you your years back, the years you spent behind bars, but what is your hope for others who are still imprisoned or, carrying criminal records at this point?
Not only will it not help me with the time that I served, I'm still currently on supervised release. So I'm still on probation. It gives me hope that people will be able to come home and be reunited with their families and made whole again, and humanely made whole. Letting people out of prison with absolutely nothing is not a way to re-enter people to society. So that needs to be worked on. That needs to be a more closely looked at aspect of, once people do come home, are we going to continue to set up roadblocks for them? And that means through jobs and housing and banking even. So there's a lot of aspects to it that I hope to see people come home and reunite with their families.
Sarah, Stephanie just touched on this a bit, but I want to get your perspective. How will the Last Prisoner Project continue to make a difference to those affected by the issues in the marijuana industry?
So again, we are really hopeful that this move is the first step on a long journey, but that we're just at the start of that journey. As Stephanie mentioned, the work doesn't end when cannabis is fully legalized. Even if the federal government completely removed cannabis from the Controlled Substances Act, that would remove criminal penalties prospectively, but it's not going to address the people who are already incarcerated. It's not going to remove the convictions for cannabis that are already on individuals' records. So we have all that work to do to reform the criminal legal implications of the past prohibition of cannabis. And to Stephanie's point, there's so much work that needs to be done, not just for those individuals, but for these communities that have been so harmed that need to be made whole. So again, we hope that this journey ends not just with a move to Schedule 3, but with full legalization, the release of all cannabis prisoners, and the reinvestment in the communities most harmed by the war on drugs.
Well, Sarah Gersten and Stephanie Shepard, thank you so much for helping us shed a light on this issue. The work you're doing is obviously, having major impact across the country. So we appreciate your time and your insight today.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. We've been closely following the uphill battle President Biden has been facing in the polls, but for the first time since October, Decision Desk HQ is reporting Biden has narrowly overtaken former President Trump by 0.1%, according to their average. Does this mean we're finally starting to see the tides turn in the president's favor? Here to go on the record is Scott Tranter, Director of Data Science from Decision Desk HQ. Scott, thank you so much for joining us here today. Just to start off with, Biden, like I said, has very narrowly topped Trump in the Decision Desk HQ average. What's behind this rise, or is this, as we say every week, part of the polar coaster?
I like that term. Part of the polar coaster is what I would say. I would bet by the end of this week, we might see Donald Trump take the lead back just because of how we see these polls being conducted. They're a mix of registered voters and likely voters, and not to put any of your listeners to sleep, but likely voters are people who are most likely to vote. Registered voters are people who don't necessarily vote all the time. And those two polls show different races depending on who shows up. And so that's why I think we're going to see these polls go back and forth.
Right. So can we expect to see the trend of Biden rising in the polls continue? I mean, you said it would go back and forth, but is there something behind this? I mean, we're seeing President Biden hit the campaign trail over the past few weeks, while Trump has been on the campaign trail, but he's also been stuck in New York City for his hush money trial.
Well, what I seem to think is, let's think way back to the first week of March. So a little more than a couple months, or about a couple months ago now, Biden was about 5-6 points behind. And that State of the Union he used as a quasi campaign kickoff. That's when he started spending a lot of money and traveling, and he closed that 4 to 5 point gap. And now we're tied. So I expect it to say the same as soon as one of the candidates go ahead, whether that be Trump or Biden. And I would say probably about 3 or 4 points. That's when I would say one campaign is taking advantage of the other or doing better than the other. To your point, Donald Trump is complaining very, very publicly and loudly that he's not able to campaign. And while Biden's out there hitting key battleground states and spending millions of dollars, so we could see him get that 3 to 4 point lead I talked about, but right now they're going back and forth. And one thing I do know is polling and trends is not a week over week thing. If we're going to see a 3 or 4 point separation for Joe Biden, we're going to see it in the next 4 to 6 weeks, not in the next week.
Right. It'll definitely take some time. So Decision Desk has also been monitoring Trump's favorability rating. And over the past year, his numbers have really been in a steady decline. Do you think this is related to his legal issues, including his current New York City hush money trial?
Yes. Short answer is yes. I mean, that is the number one news story in and around Trump, and he's in the news quite a bit. It's not necessarily a good thing. This week, they're going to have Stormy Daniels on the stand, and they're probably going to say some not good things about his past on the stand. Whether or not he gets convicted or not is a different question. This news around him is not necessarily good. Now, it doesn't necessarily hurt his Republican core voters, but certainly those swayable independents, and I think that's what we're seeing in this favorability dip here.
So sticking with the former president, a new Washington Post Ipsos survey shows fewer Black Americans say they are certain they will vote in this year's election. Black voters are obviously a crucial voting bloc for Democrats. So where could lower Black voter turnout hurt Biden the most? And, does this mean it helps Trump?
It absolutely does help Trump, and it's 3 places I would look at this fall where that could hurt Joe Biden. I would look at it in Philadelphia, Milwaukee, and Detroit. 3 key urban areas that he's going to need to win in states that are razor thin right now, separated. These 2 candidates are separated by, 1 or 2 percentage points, or the equivalent of maybe 30, 40,000 votes in each state. So that percentage downswing, while still the majority of them are going to vote, still that those margins could hurt him this fall, and something that his campaign's going to hopefully focus on if they want to be competitive.
So I want to take a closer look at individual states. We know that former President Trump will make his first campaign visit to Minnesota later this month. That state is a Democratic stronghold, and a Republican presidential candidate hasn't won it since, 1972? Is Trump's strategy connected to Biden's weakness with the uncommitted vote we saw earlier this year in Minnesota?
It absolutely is. It's connected to that. It's also connected to the fact that there's 25% of Minnesotan eligible voters who have not voted in any recent presidential election. And Donald Trump does well amongst that block of voters. In other words, if he can get people who don't normally vote in the presidential election, they're going to probably come out and vote for him. And while it has been a solidly Democratic state, again, it's another state where 60, 70,000 votes could be the difference, just given the total turnout. And so it is a good offensive target for him. And we see Joe Biden doing the same. Joe Biden's trying to do in North Carolina what Donald Trump is trying to do in Minnesota. So this is the standard campaigns, trying to gnaw at each other or go after each other's potential weaknesses.
Trump's also heading to D.C., making an appearance at the Libertarian Party National Convention. Do you think this means Trump is finally seeing RFK Jr. as a threat to his re-election bid?
Yeah, I look at it as twofold. One is, yes, I think he is reading the same polling and done the same focus groups that some of his pollsters have seen. As RFK gets his message out there, he does take Republican voters. But two, again, this is an electoral knife fight. Anytime you can get an extra 1-2% of voters, or at least on another party line in some states, you need to go ahead and take that. So this is a smart electoral college move, or raw vote move by Donald Trump on both just the straight numbers as well as seeing that, RFK could be taking voters from him.
So moving to the economy, last week's jobs report was weaker than expected, and former President Trump is already hitting President Biden over these numbers. Plus, we're seeing record high interest rates are holding steady. How worried should Biden be about getting his messaging on the economy out there? And do you think he's essentially figured out a good message at this point?
He should be extremely worried, and I still think he's trying to figure out his messaging strategy there. I mean, look, the economy has been the number one issue going back to the 2022 cycle. So this isn't a surprise. No one can say this popped up on him. It's these macroeconomic indicators like jobs and inflation and things like that. I know that's a good messaging from a communication standpoint, but the average American is paying more at the pump, more at the grocery store, more for vacations, more for flights, more for cars than they were under the Trump administration. And Trump is going to remind them of that. And so that is going to be the economic battle that the Biden campaign needs to prepare for, especially since I don't think, despite what's going around in the world, that the economy will be supplanted as the number one issue. It's going to be what we're going to be talking about in October, is my guess.
So another topic I wanted to jump in on is the variation in polling results. Americans see conflicting numbers where new polling will show a neck and neck race, while another poll will have Trump or Biden leading by several points. Statistically, how are these variations happening, and what indicators should Americans be looking at in order to find quality polls?
Oh man, so this week we could spend an hour on this. I would say this is the general consensus. If I were looking at polls, is you have to look at them in aggregate. Don't trust any single poll. Look at them in terms of an average, and then do understand that while they are specific numbers, maybe even numbers with decimal points, they're not intended to be precise. They're intended to be directional. So if you see a 3 or 4 point separation, don't look at that as the person who's got 3 or 4 points ahead is definitely ahead. Look at them as directionally ahead, given the margin of error. And again, not to put anyone to sleep, margin of error in many of these polls is between 4 and 7 points. So unless someone is consistently 7-8 points outside ahead of the other person, you can consider them potentially behind or potentially tied. The best average to look at is obviously the Hill DDHQ one. We're not biased in what polls we collect. We're very fair in terms of what questions we collect, and we try and be as inclusive as possible because the wisdom and the amount of data is pretty significant.
So Trump's sweepstakes are heating up with a short list very much coming together. We're seeing it all over the news media. We know that South Carolina Senator Tim Scott dodged questions on whether he would accept the 2024 election results, while South Dakota Governor Kristi Noem has been on a publicity tour of some sort, cleaning up her comments in her new book. How is Trump testing these candidates or these potential candidates, and what is he looking for?
I like that, publicity tour of some sort. That's the nice way to put it. You know what? Both those candidates, and you see Elise Stefanik out there at fundraisers, all these candidates know the best way to audition is to be on television and be on the stump and saying things supportive of, former President Trump's campaign. So that's why we see Tim Scott equivocating on who won the 2020 election, which to me personally, that's a load of BS. He knows who won, and I think that is a perfect example of how he thinks he's still in the VP running. We see Kristi Noem out there in terms of trying to defend her book and talk about how she was talking to Kim Jong-un, which she had to retract, all those different kinds of things, trying to look presidential. Elise Stefanik out there as a bulldog in terms of attacking Joe Biden and the Democrats in fundraising. All these candidates are still in the running, and they know the best way to do it is to be public about their support. And all that tells me is that Donald Trump hasn't made his decision, because if he had, none of these people would be out there doing or saying what they're saying.
Yeah, you make a good point about these candidates being on television. We know that Donald Trump watches a lot of cable news and pays attention to it. Speaking of news media, though, we're seeing another sharp divide between supporters of Trump and Biden over their media consumption. A recent NBC News poll found that Biden leads among voters who consume traditional media, while Trump leads among voters who say they are digital media consumers. Scott, what kind of impact do you think media consumption could ultimately have on the election and the election results?
Oh, I think media consumption is going to play a big impact in this cycle's election. And it goes back to, I mean, this is every presidential election, going back to the first televised debate with Nixon, over 50 years ago. It largely comes down to how much you consume, how much of a critical thinker you are, and whether or not you're consuming news or opinion. There's lots of PhDs minted every year about the studying of that. What I would take away from that poll, though, is Donald Trump tends to do better with people who aren't as politically attuned. And that is new. That has not necessarily been the case for a Republican candidate in the past. And so how we look at turnout, if we see a higher than normal turnout, that means that we are getting some of these non-politically attuned voters out. That bodes well for him going into the fall. And so that is one number I'm paying attention to as we look at news media consumption, is what does turnout look like? Who's coming out to vote?
And we'll be watching those turnout numbers as well. Scott Tranter, as always, thank you so much for joining us here to break it all down.
Thanks for having me.
That's it for What's America Thinking. Come back next week. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe to the Hill's YouTube channel. And we want to hear from you. Leave your comments and let us know what's on your mind.